Chapter 4, where we started this process, the study of chapter 4 and 5 is a unit. But in chapter 4, we began looking at the elements of biblical worship. The elements of biblical worship are worship as God portrays it in heaven. And if you remember, we started in chapter 4, the first 7 verses, and we saw that God portrays holiness as a setting for the worship that he desires. And before we heard the words or saw the actions of those worshiping saints, God gave us the first element. The first element of biblical worship is holiness is always the atmosphere of worship in heaven. The atmosphere, what surrounds, what is in the background of everything going on in heaven is holiness. And that's what the first 7 verses are about. Before we see anything they say, anything else of the redeemed, God paints this picture, and we looked at it for several of our Sundays together. And so what that first element teaches us, that holiness is always the atmosphere of true biblical worship, is this, that God thinks the setting for worship is important. Now think about that. God desires the atmosphere that surrounds worship as it rises to him to be holiness. And that, when he can completely control the atmosphere, it's holiness. And that's what he desires. God wants our worship to start by a reverent focus on him. Do you remember the Lord's Prayer? In your mind, think about it. Jesus commanded that our prayers follow that pattern. Not say those words, follow the pattern. What's the pattern? As we look up, we say, "Our Father who art in heaven," he's up on the throne, "hallowed be thy name." Do you see that? That atmosphere of worship is an atmosphere of holiness. And prayer is so much a part of our worship that God desires that reverent hallowing of his name be the first element. Secondly, in Revelation chapter 4, verse 8, and if you remember a few weeks ago, we saw that God presents to us that our worship of him as saints around his throne is responsive. We respond to him. And that God actually initiates worship, just like God initiates salvation. And our worship back to God in this atmosphere of holiness is a response to his holiness. And the second element is true biblical worship is always a response to God's holiness. Our worship around the throne of heaven is not prompted by individuals. It's divinely prompted. And basically we saw that the first glimpse of our worship takes place after the prompting of those seraphim. Do you remember seraph? They're burning ones. And those seraphim are burning. And it's a picture of consuming fire, and our God is a consuming fire. And it's a picture of that holiness. And as a response to that holiness, the worship is offered. Thirdly, in verse 11, if you look at the end of the chapter, God reveals the content, not just the atmosphere, not just the response to that atmosphere, but the content. The content of our worship is completely focused upon the Lord as glorious and honored and powerful. True biblical worship, the third element that we learned is always focused on God. Now, outside of Calvary, if you just took all of America's churches, and if you took all of their music and analyzed it, someone recently told me that in their travels, because they're one of these traveling, they're all over the country, they said they sense, and I believe if we did a survey, that more and more of the worship of America's churches is kind of eroding away from being totally centered on God to more and more be targeted at human emotions, kind of like feeling better, kind of, we're going to make it kind of stuff, instead of saying, God, we aren't even worthy of coming into your presence, and you are awesome and holy, which, by the way, is what opens the way for his power, which is able to keep us in every way. But true biblical worship is always focused on God. Every word we will say in heaven is so carefully chosen to lift God's name, to make God's work the focus, and to reflect our gratitude. You notice that in heaven, only God gets the attention. You don't see the seraphim kind of, taking a bow. They do take a bow, but the bow is they cover their faces. They don't even want to be seen. And there is such humility portrayed in heaven.